There is a particular quiet that settles over markets sometimes, and I have learned to pay closer attention to it than to any headline, because the quiet is telling me something the noise never could. It is the quiet I am sitting with now. A strange and almost weightless calm, where prices drift and volatility compresses, and everyone seems to have agreed, without quite saying it aloud, that the difficult questions can be postponed a little longer. I find myself returning to that feeling again and again, not because I think it is the prelude to some dramatic event I can predict, but because the calm itself is a kind of data, and I have spent enough years watching systems behave to know that surface tranquility and underlying stability are not the same thing, and that confusing the two is one of the most expensive mistakes a thinking person can make. Let me be careful here at the very beginning, because the subject invites a certain kind of voice that I want nothing to do with. I am not describing a collapse. I am not sketching a conspiracy, or a hidden hand, or some coordinated scheme working in the shadows to relieve you of your savings. I do not believe in those stories. And I find that the people who tell them usually understand the least about how monetary systems actually function. What I am describing is something far more ordinary and far more interesting, which is arithmetic and the slow accumulation of structural pressure inside a system that continues to look calm on the surface precisely because the pressure has not yet found its release. That is not a prophecy. It is closer to physics, and the intelligent response to it is neither panic nor denial, but something quieter and more useful, which is preparation carried out during the window when preparation is still possible. So I want to think out loud about what a calm window actually is, because the phrase can sound almost mystical, and it is not mystical at all. A calm window is simply an interval of time in which the market's expectations and the system's underlying trajectory have temporarily drifted apart, and the gap between them has not yet been forced to close. In every complex system, there is a difference between the story the participants are telling themselves and the arithmetic that is quietly running underneath. Most of the time, these two things move roughly together, and the story stays honest enough. But every so often, for reasons that are usually psychological rather than mathematical, the story detaches from the arithmetic and floats free for a while. And during that interval, everything feels stable, feels almost serene. And the very serenity becomes the reason people stop examining the foundation. That interval is the window. It is genuinely a window in the sense that it has edges, that it opens and it closes, and that what you can do inside it is different from what you can do outside it. I have come to believe that these windows are the most important intervals in a financial life and also the most wasted, because they arrive disguised as ordinary time. When a crisis is loud, everyone pays attention. But by then, the useful decisions have already been foreclosed. It is in the quiet, the boring, the seemingly uneventful stretch that the real positioning happens. And it happens invisibly, in the choices that a small number of people make while everyone else is reassured by the flatness of the surface. The window does not announce itself. It does not come with a warning. It simply presents itself as a season in which nothing much seems to be happening, and that appearance of nothing happening is exactly the disguise that makes it so easy to squander. Now, why do systems look most stable right before they reprice? This is the part that most people find genuinely counterintuitive, because our instinct is to assume that stability builds gradually and that danger announces itself with tremors. But complex systems do not usually work that way. They accumulate fragility precisely during the periods of apparent calm, because calm reduces the perceived cost of taking on risk, and reduced perceived risk invites more leverage, more crowding into the same positions, more confidence that the recent past is a reliable guide to the near future. The very tranquility that makes everyone comfortable is what allows the fragility to build undetected. Stability, past a certain point, becomes the raw material of instability. because it lowers everyone's guard at exactly the moment the guard is most needed. This is not a paradox invented for effect. It is how leverage behaves in the presence of comfort, and it is why the smoothest part of the ride is so often the last part. I think of it the way an engineer thinks about a structure under load. A beam does not signal you continuously as the stress rises within it. It holds, and it holds, and it holds. And from the outside, it looks exactly as solid at 99% of its tolerance as it did at 10%. The information about the accumulated stress is real, but it is not visible on the surface, and the surface is all most observers ever look at. Monetary systems are like this. The debt accumulates, the obligations compound, the gap between what has been promised and what can genuinely be produced widens year after year, and none of it disturbs the placid surface of daily prices until the moment it does. And when it does not arrive gradually. It arrives the way these things always arrive, slowly and then suddenly, which is not a clever phrase but an accurate description of how thresholds work in systems that hold their stress silently. Let me get concrete about the arithmetic underneath the calm, because I do not want to leave this at the level of metaphor. When a system carries obligations that grow faster than its capacity to produce real value, there are only a limited number of ways that gap can eventually resolve, and every one of them has been walked before. The obligations can be honored in full through genuine growth, which is the happy path and the one everyone hopes for, but it requires that productive capability expand fast enough to outrun the compounding of the promises, and compounding is a formidable opponent. The obligations can be defaulted on openly, which is rare among issuers who control their own currency because they have a softer alternative. Or the obligations can be honored in nominal terms while being quietly diminished in real terms, which is to say, the promises are technically kept while the substance of what is delivered is eroded through the slow reduction in the purchasing power of the unit itself. This last path is the one that history returns to again and again, not because anyone is villainous, but because it is the path of least political resistance, the one that spreads the cost so diffusely and so gradually that no single decision ever appears to be the decisive one. And this is where the psychology becomes inseparable from the economics. Because a system can only run this arithmetic for as long as its participants continue to accept the unit at something close to its stated value. The entire structure rests on a shared belief, a confidence that is largely unexamined, precisely because examining it is uncomfortable, and because, for most of any person's life, the belief has held. The arithmetic can deteriorate for a very long time beneath a confidence that remains intact, and this is the source of the calm. The numbers are already saying one thing while the psychology is still saying another, and the window is the interval between them. It is genuinely a gap in time, a lag between what is true structurally and what is believed collectively. And it is inside that lag that the thoughtful actor has room to move. Most people cannot see this. And I want to be fair about why. Because it is not stupidity. It is that updating a stable and long-held assumption is one of the hardest things a mind can do, far harder than acquiring a new belief on a blank slate. When you have lived your entire adult life inside a particular monetary order, that order stops feeling like a choice or a construct and starts feeling like the weather, like a permanent feature of reality rather than a specific arrangement with a beginning and, presumably, an end. The assumption becomes load-bearing for your whole model of the world. And to question it, you would have to disturb everything built on top of it, and the mind protects itself from that disturbance through a kind of quiet refusal to look. This is not a moral failing. It is a cognitive economy. But the cost of that economy is that the people most invested in the stability of the current arrangement are precisely the ones least able to prepare for its transition. Because preparation would require them to entertain, seriously and without flinching, the possibility that the weather can change. If you sit with that for a while, you begin to understand that the real scarce resource in these moments is not information, but the willingness to act on information that contradicts your settled sense of normal. And this is genuinely where the durable outcomes are decided, in the quality of one's positioning rather than the accuracy of one's forecast. It is worth understanding this distinction with some rigor, because the difference between building lasting wealth and merely riding the tide comes down to how leverage, ownership, and specific knowledge actually interact. And there is a systematic account of exactly this that lays out the underlying principles with real care, called the Naval Codex. It is not a set of predictions, and it is not a portfolio of tips. It is a framework for understanding the structure of intelligent positioning itself, the mechanics of how a small number of people come to own the productive capability of a system rather than merely renting their labor to it. If that way of thinking is useful to you, I would suggest engaging with the principles directly rather than treating them as slogans. And you will find the framework linked in the description below, and you can reach it as well by scanning the code that appears on the screen. What matters is not the label, but the discipline of thinking structurally about where you stand. And I want to return to exactly that, because the historical record has a great deal to teach about how these transitions actually arrive. When people imagine a monetary reset, if they imagine it at all, they tend to picture something cinematic, a single dramatic morning when the old order visibly breaks. But that is almost never how it has happened. Monetary regime changes have historically arrived as processes rather than events, unfolding over years, sometimes over more than a decade, in a sequence of adjustments, each of which seems manageable in isolation and only reveals its meaning in aggregate. The unit does not usually die in a day. It is diminished in increments, revalued against real things in a series of steps, each of which is met with reassurance, and each of which resets the baseline for the next. And precisely because it happens this way, in increments beneath a rhetoric of continuity, most participants never experience it as a reset at all. They experience it as a gradual strangeness, a sense that things cost more than they used to, and that saving feels less rewarding than it once did, without ever quite naming the larger transition they are living through. I want to resist the temptation to make this sound uniquely modern, because it is not. And the belief that our moment is unprecedented is itself a symptom of the short time horizon that makes people vulnerable. Monetary orders have been established and have dissolved repeatedly across recorded history, and the underlying dynamic is remarkably consistent even as the specific instruments change. A dominant unit emerges, usually anchored by the productive and often the military preeminence of whoever issues it. The privilege of issuing the dominant unit is genuinely enormous, because it allows the issuer to run imbalances that would be impossible for anyone else, to consume more than it produces, and to borrow more than it could otherwise sustain, all financed by the world's willingness to hold its paper. But that very privilege contains the seed of its own erosion, because the exorbitant advantage removes the discipline that would otherwise constrain the issuer, and over long enough horizons, the absence of discipline compounds into exactly the deterioration we have been discussing. This is not a statement about any nation's character or virtue. I want to be explicit that I am describing the structural position of an issuer at a particular stage of a trajectory, not the intrinsic qualities of a people or a culture, because the essentialist reading of these dynamics is both false and lazy. The same structural pressures would operate on any issuer occupying the same position, and history obliges us by showing that they have. What changes across these episodes is the speed and the mechanism, not the shape. In eras of slower information and slower capital, the transitions took longer and were felt more locally. In our era, where capital moves at the speed of a keystroke and where the perceptions of millions of participants can shift almost in unison, the potential for the sudden phase of the slowly and then suddenly dynamic to be genuinely sudden is greater than it has ever been. This does not mean it will be violent. It means that the interval between the recognition and the repricing may be compressed, which raises the value of having positioned oneself before the recognition becomes general rather than after. The window, in other words, may close faster than the windows of previous eras closed. And that is a structural fact worth sitting with, not a cause for alarm, but a reason for a certain seriousness about the use of present time. Now, the honest thing to say about how these transitions unfold is that they follow patterns which can be studied, and that the study of them is not doom-mongering, but the opposite, a way of replacing vague anxiety with structural understanding. There is a framework that traces precisely this. The anatomy of how monetary transitions have historically unfolded and how thoughtful actors have arranged their assets to carry wealth across the discontinuity rather than have it dissolved in the crossing. And it is called Dragon Pivot. I want to be clear about what it is and what it is not. It is not a forecast of a date, and it is not a promise that any particular outcome is certain. Those who sell certainty about timing are selling something that cannot exist. What it is a careful map of the recurring mechanics of reserve currency erosion and inflation dynamics and the sequence in which the pieces have tended to move, so that you can recognize the stage of the trajectory rather than being surprised by it. I would encourage you to sit with the underlying principles themselves rather than any single conclusion. And the framework is available through the link you will find in the description, and equally by scanning the code shown on the screen. But a framework is only as useful as the equanimity you bring to it, and so I want to turn to the human dimension, to the question of who has actually used these quiet years and who has wasted them, because that is where the abstract becomes personal. In every one of these historical transitions, there have been two kinds of people, and I do not mean rich and poor, because that division cuts across the one I actually care about. I mean those who understood, before the transition became obvious, that the quiet years were a resource, and those who mistook the quiet for permanence. The ones who understood did not necessarily predict the timing, and they were rarely the loudest voices, and they almost never described what they were doing in dramatic terms. They simply, patiently, and without panic, shifted the structure of what they owned during the interval, when shifting was still cheap and still optional. They moved, over time, from holding claims denominated in the unit whose real value was quietly eroding, toward owning genuine productive capability, real assets that would still be real on the other side of the transition, regardless of what the unit was worth. They did this early when it looked unnecessary, and the fact that it looked unnecessary is exactly why it was possible. And the ones who wasted the window were not foolish people. This is the part I want to insist upon, because it would be comforting to believe that only fools miss these things, and it is not true. The ones who wasted the window were often intelligent, informed, and entirely capable of understanding the arithmetic if they had chosen to look at it. What they lacked was not intelligence, but the willingness to act ahead of certainty, and this is a distinct and rare capacity. They wanted the transition to be confirmed before they moved. They wanted the safety of acting only when the direction was undeniable. And by the time it was undeniable, the window had closed and the repricing had already occurred, which is to say the cost of acting had already been extracted from them. They were not punished for being wrong. They were punished for waiting to be certain, which in these matters is the same as being late, because certainty and opportunity are almost never available at the same moment. This is the psychology of waiting for certainty, and I find it to be one of the deepest and most human of all the errors, because it does not feel like an error while you are committing it. It feels like prudence. It feels like the responsible refusal to act on incomplete information. And in ordinary circumstances, that refusal genuinely is prudence, which is what makes it so treacherous here, because the very habit that serves you well in stable times betrays you precisely at the transition. The demand for certainty is a demand to be shown the future, and the future does not show itself. It only reveals, in hindsight, that the signs were there all along for anyone willing to act on probability rather than proof. The intelligent actor in a calm window has made peace with acting on a distribution of outcomes rather than a single confirmed one, has accepted that the cost of being early is bounded and tolerable while the cost of being late is neither, and has therefore structured their affairs to be approximately right ahead of time, rather than precisely right too late. The concept that unlocks this whole way of thinking is optionality. And I want to develop it carefully because it is so often reduced to a slogan. Optionality is the property of a position that lets you benefit from a favorable outcome while limiting your loss from an unfavorable one. And its true value is greatest exactly when uncertainty is greatest, which is to say, in the calm window, before a transition whose timing cannot be known. When you cannot know when or precisely how a repricing will arrive, The wrong response is to make a single concentrated bet on your best guess, because a concentrated bet requires you to be right about the timing, and the timing is the one thing you cannot be right about. The right response is to structure yourself so that you are robust across a range of outcomes, so that you preserve your capital and your capability regardless of when the transition comes, while retaining meaningful exposure to the outcomes that would reward foresight. That is not a gamble. It is close to the opposite of a gamble. It is the deliberate construction of a position that does not depend on prediction, and it is genuinely the most sophisticated thing a person can do with the gift of an interval of calm. The asset structure that follows from this thinking is not exotic and it is not a secret, and I distrust anyone who presents it as either. It comes down to a distinction that is old and that most people feel they already understand until they examine their own holdings and discover they have not applied it at all. It is the distinction between assets that represent genuine productive capability and assets that are merely claims, financial instruments whose value depends on the continued honoring of a promise denominated in a unit whose real value is precisely what is in question. A claim is a promise. A productive asset is a thing that produces. In ordinary times, the difference between them is subtle and easy to ignore, because the promises are honored and the units hold their value, and the distinction seems academic. But a monetary transition is exactly the circumstance in which that subtle difference becomes the whole difference, because it is precisely the reliability of the promise and the value of the unit that the transition calls into question. To hold through such an interval, a portfolio composed mostly of claims denominated in the eroding unit is to hold a portfolio whose entire premise is the thing being repriced. And to have shifted ahead of time and without drama toward ownership of genuine productive capability is to hold something that remains what it is, regardless of what happens to the unit. There is a body of work devoted specifically to this question of asset structure, to the patient construction of durable and generationally significant wealth grounded in real productive assets and real institutional protection rather than in financial engineering. And it is called the sovereign vault. I mention it here because this is the natural point at which the thinking demands it. Not as a product to be pushed, but as a framework to be understood. It is not a scheme for rapid gains, and it is emphatically not a set of clever financial structures layered on top of the very fragility we have been examining. It is closer to the opposite, an argument for the primacy of the real and the durable over the engineered and the fragile. If the distinction between owning production and holding claims is one you want to think through with genuine rigor, the framework is worth engaging on its own terms, and you can find it linked in the description below, as well as by scanning the code that appears on the screen. But I want to return from the structure to the disposition, because the finest asset structure in the world is useless in the hands of someone who cannot hold it with equanimity, and equanimity is genuinely the rarer thing. What does preparation actually look like when it is done without panic, which is the only way it is worth doing? It looks from the outside like very little. It looks like a series of unhurried decisions made over months and years, each one modest, none of them dramatic, cumulatively transforming the structure of what a person owns and how exposed they are to a transition they cannot time. It does not look like a frantic reallocation in response to a headline. It does not look like the abandonment of one's productive life to obsess over macroeconomic forecasts, which is itself a kind of trap, because the person who becomes consumed by the coming transition has, in a sense, already been diminished by it, has surrendered their present to their anxiety about the future. The genuinely prepared person continues to build, continues to compound their specific knowledge and their productive capability, continues to live fully in the present, and simply does so from a structural position that does not depend on the current monetary arrangement remaining exactly as it is. Preparation and equanimity are not in tension. They are the same disposition seen from two angles. I think the deepest reason people fail to prepare, even when they intellectually grasp everything I have described, is that preparation during a calm window requires acting against the grain of one's own immediate experience. Every day that the calm persists, is a day on which preparation looks slightly foolish, slightly premature, slightly like worrying about nothing. The feedback that preparation generates in the short run is negative feedback, a small ongoing cost with no visible benefit, and human beings are exquisitely sensitive to short-run feedback and remarkably poor at valuing protection against low-probability, high-consequence events that have not yet materialized. This is why insurance is chronically underpurchased, right up until the moment it becomes unavailable. The calm window punishes the prepared with a daily sense of having overreacted, and it rewards the complacent with a daily sense of having been right, and it does this consistently, right up until the instant it reverses everything. And by then, the daily feedback that shaped everyone's behavior for years is revealed to have been exactly inverted from the truth. To prepare well is therefore to accept looking slightly wrong for a long time in exchange for being structurally right at the moment it counts, and that is an emotional discipline as much as an intellectual one. And there is a subtler failure even than complacency, which is the failure of the person who sees the transition clearly but responds to it with fear. And I want to distinguish these carefully because they are opposite errors that lead to the same poor outcome. The complacent person underprepares because they do not believe the transition is real. The fearful person overreacts, abandons their productive life, retreats into a defensive crouch, and in doing so gives up the very compounding of capability and specific knowledge that would have served them best across the transition and beyond it. Both have surrendered their equanimity, one to comfort and one to dread, and both will emerge from the transition worse positioned than the person who held the clear middle. The clear middle is not a compromise between complacency and fear. It is a distinct third thing. A disposition of alert, unhurried, structural seriousness, the willingness to see the arithmetic plainly and to respond to it deliberately without letting it colonize one's inner life. That disposition is genuinely rare, and I have come to believe it is the single most valuable thing a person can cultivate for these intervals, more valuable than any specific asset or any specific insight, because it is the thing that allows every asset and every insight to be used well. There is something almost paradoxical in how the calm window rewards its users, because what it rewards is not activity, but a particular kind of patient positioning followed by stillness. The person who uses the window well does a certain amount of deliberate work during it, and then, crucially, waits, holding their structure with discipline, resisting the constant temptation to second-guess it as the calm persists and the preparation continues to look unnecessary. This is where time horizons become decisive, because the person operating on a short horizon cannot tolerate the extended period of looking wrong and abandons their position before it pays, while the person operating on a genuinely long horizon can hold through the extended interval because they are not measuring themselves against the daily surface. The long time horizon is not merely a virtue in the abstract. It is the specific psychological capacity that makes it possible to use a calm window at all, because the window's rewards are, by their nature, deferred and lumpy and invisible until they suddenly are not. Compounding rewards the patient, and so does positioning, and the two are more alike than they appear, because both require you to endure a long stretch during which nothing visible is happening in exchange for a nonlinear payoff that arrives. When it arrives, all at once. I want to say something about the relationship between all of this and ownership versus labor, because it sits underneath everything else, and I do not want to leave it implicit. A person who lives primarily by selling their labor is, whether they think about it this way or not, holding a position that is denominated almost entirely in the current monetary unit and in the current structure of the economy, and that position has very little optionality with respect to a transition. Their income is a stream of claims in the eroding unit, and their security depends on the continuation of arrangements they do not control. A person who owns genuine, productive capability, by contrast, holds something whose value is anchored to the real economy rather than to the unit of account, and who therefore carries, built into their very position, a kind of natural resilience against monetary transition. This is one more reason, beyond all the ordinary ones, that the shift from labor toward ownership is the central financial project of a thinking life, and it is the reason that becomes most vivid precisely in the intervals we have been discussing. The calm window is, among other things, an especially good time to accelerate that shift, because the assets one would want to own are still priced by a market that has not yet repriced the unit, which is to say they can still be acquired on the terms of the old arithmetic before the new arithmetic arrives. None of this, I want to reiterate as I begin to draw these threads together, requires believing in any single dramatic outcome, and I would be suspicious of my own reasoning if it did. The value of thinking this way does not depend on the transition arriving on any particular timeline or in any particular form. If the calm persists for many more years, the person who has prepared with equanimity has lost very little, because their preparation consisted mostly in owning better things and thinking more clearly, both of which are good in themselves regardless of any transition. And if the transition arrives, whether slowly and then suddenly or through some sequence none of us has quite imagined, that same person is positioned to carry their wealth and their capability across it. This asymmetry is the whole point. Preparation of this kind has a bounded and tolerable cost and an unbounded and asymmetric benefit, which is simply optionality applied to one's entire financial existence, and it is available to be constructed only during the interval when the future is still uncertain, which is to say only inside the calm window and never outside it. Once the transition is underway, the option is no longer for sale. I find, sitting with the quiet as I have been, that the thing I keep returning to is not the arithmetic and not the history and not even the asset structure, all of which can be studied and understood by anyone willing to look. What I keep returning to is the strange and precious quality of the interval itself. This gift of time that a calm window represents, a stretch of hours and days and years in which the future has not yet foreclosed the choices of the present. We so rarely recognize such intervals while we are inside them. We recognize them afterward, in hindsight, when we say to ourselves that we should have seen it, that the signs were there, that we had the time and did not use it. But the whole nature of a calm window is that it is only visible as an opportunity from within while it is still open, and only visible as a loss from without once it has closed. To perceive it as an opportunity while you are still standing inside it, and to act on that perception with patience rather than panic, is a rare and quiet form of wisdom that has nothing to do with prediction and everything to do with disposition. Because the window is not a prediction, and I want to be careful to end on exactly that note rather than on any forecast, because a forecast would betray everything I have tried to say. I am not telling you when anything will happen, and anyone who claims to know the timing understands less than they pretend. The window is not a claim about the future at all. It is a description of the present, of the particular quality this present moment has, the quality of being an interval in which the arithmetic and the confidence have drifted apart and the gap between them has not yet been forced to close. That interval is a gift. And like all gifts of time, it is entirely neutral as to how it is used. It rewards no one automatically. It does not care whether you prepare or not. It simply offers to anyone willing to see it clearly and to act with equanimity, the one thing that cannot be acquired once the transition has begun, which is time itself, unhurried time, time to think and to position and to build before the terms change. And time, in the end, is the only thing these windows ever really offer, and the only thing they ever finally take away. Because a window is defined by the fact that it closes, and the closing comes, as these things always come, and then suddenly, what you do with the quiet before it closes is the only part of any of this that has ever been yours to decide.